I want you to take a moment, and without standing, I want you to high-five your neighbor. You have made it to the end of a long series. Congratulations. You're here. You're still alive. I think this is one of the longest series we've done. Probably been about 16, 17 weeks. We started early summer. And guess what? We're only in the completion of part 2. So make plans to be with us for part 3, which will start early in February. And it will look at the final week of Jesus' life and take us right through Easter. And you don't want to miss the conclusion to Mark. But let's finish with a conclusion for this section. And you will see how Mark is also pointing us to this man, this healing, as his conclusion as well and his encouragement to us. It's one thing to be given advice, to be told advice, have advice spoken to you, and hopefully you will, if good advice comes your way, it comes into your ears, into your heart, you will heed that advice and trust it and move forward in a positive way. But it is another thing to witness positive examples before your eyes and in your life. It's another thing to witness, we could say, positive or negative examples right before your very eyes. That's the kind of stuff you don't forget, is when you see it lived out. I'll never forget my ride to school in the 9th grade. I didn't want to do the bus anymore. My mom and dad said, if you find a ride, maybe somebody from church is in your high school, big high school, and they said, if you find a ride that you can get to go, hey, you don't have to take the bus. So I found a ride with a kid from my youth group named Sean Slusser. And Sean Slusser was a country boy, and he had a big truck he was really proud of, and he wanted to be the first truck in the parking lot to get his parking space at the high school there. And Sean would pick up another guy from the youth group, and then I lived pretty close to the high school. He would swing by, and he would pick me up. Now, Sean was a wonderful dude, but he acted like a little bit of a know-it-all sometimes. And I'll never forget, early in our rides to school, it was probably the second week or the third week of school, we start to see on the road to the high school, smoke begins pouring out of the hood of his prized truck. Sean began to panic, and he pulled over to the gas station right there, and just frantic came all over him. He lost all sense of calm and cool, and he jumped out. He popped the hood open, and the other kid sitting, now this was a single bed truck, just 3 of us, 1 seat. He was sitting in the middle because he would get in the truck first, but he was older than me too. And he nudges me, and he says, watch this, Sean is freaking out. And I said, what do you mean? He says he is worried the car is overheating, and get ready, he is getting ready to take that radiator cap off with a hot vehicle. And you could see, the hood would come up, and you could see Sean back and forth moving. He came around, I think he got a piece of cloth. He was touching that radiator, and it was so hot, and he got ready. And my buddy, he tried to warn, say, Sean, don't mess with it, man. You got to let it cool down. Now we're going to be late to school. My engine's going to be shot. I got to let out the pressure and the heat. That's the one thing you're not supposed to do. And sure enough, he grabbed that cloth, went back around to the front of the truck, and he popped that radiator cap off, and that thing shot up in the air, and nasty radiator coolant fluid shot up like a volcano. Everything was wet. The engine, him, he was like, it's hot. He's jumping up and down, and that older kid sitting next to me was laughing his head off. I was worried. My eyes were big. Luckily, he was okay. He didn't suffer any burns, just a lot of embarrassment. He said, listen, I'm a mess. I'm going to take you guys to school. We put some fluid in, take you to school, and then I'm done for the day. I'm calling a mechanic, and he went home for a change of clothes and worked on his truck. That was 30 years ago. And that bad example, still to this day, whenever I've been tempted to take that radiator cap off, I still picture Sean Slusser jumping up and down with scalding water, and I think, don't do it, Burgbacher. Wait a few more minutes. and make sure it's cool before you add the coolant. To this day, when I teach my kids about, hey, sometimes a car overheats, you got to pull over, here's some signs to look for, these things happen, it could be oil, it could be coolant, it could be a fan's gone out, I don't know much about cars, but I will point to that radiator cap, and I will tell them, whatever you do, don't take this thing off while it's hot after it's been running. How many of you have some stories of some negative examples in your life you've seen and you've said, never for me, I'm not going to do that? You've got some stories out there of some negative examples you've learned from. And hopefully you have just as many stories of positive examples or positive people who have been important to you in life. Maybe a hardworking parent or a frugal friend. Maybe the faithful marriage of someone else or some grandparents you've seen in life. Maybe a seasoned employee who's shown you the ropes and brought you under their wing and how to do things around the company. Maybe a spouse, hopefully a spouse who's modeled Christ-likeness for you and for your family. And hopefully any number of friends you've seen in the church, in the life of the church, who have steadily served the Lord throughout their lives. We show godly wisdom when we learn from both the negative and the positive examples of our lives. In fact, wisdom in the scriptures works like this. You can go back to Proverbs. Here's the ways of people heading in the wrong way. Don't be like them. Here's what it looks like to walk in the paths of righteousness. Be like these guys. And so throughout the Bible, the authors will use negative and positive examples. And Mark does the same throughout his gospel for his listeners. I want to show you the same chart we looked at last week because we've covered so much ground. We actually started in chapter 4 this summer, and we're in a final section of this middle zone of Mark. And it's a subsection that begins there in chapter 8. And I want you to find your bearings one more time, especially if you're a guest coming in, because I want you to see how the story we end with is a story of example for all of us. So just to find our place again, we've been in a section of Mark where Mark picks up the pace of the storytelling. He picks up the pace and he uses a phrase repeatedly, on the way to Jerusalem, on the way with Jesus, on the roadside. They were headed here, they were headed there. And we know that Mark, after a section where the disciples have wrestled with spiritual seeing, and they've wrestled with spiritual hearing, and they've wrestled with dullness to believe in who Jesus was, and their own amazement and their own lack of faith, Mark says that they're being retaught by Jesus on the way how to be disciples, and they've got to relearn kingdom values. Kingdom values. And so we saw last week, we saw how this section is anchored around predictions of this upside down world where they think Jesus is headed to glory. Jesus says, no, I've come to be a servant and to serve the many. And if you want to be great among us, you must lower yourself. And so Jesus is predicting his death again and again. And each time he predicts his own death, he locks them in onto the upside down world of kingdom values. And last week we ended right here in this space right here. All of this reaches a climactic statement because we don't know why Jesus must die. And at the end of last week, we saw this huge statement where Jesus says he comes to give his life as a ransom for the many. And so we're left with this question. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean? And Mark is going to tell this story right here today as the conclusion to what we have been studying. And in the spring, you and I will head to the weeks of Jerusalem, and we'll look at what Mark wants us to know there. But before we get there, Mark has been using all along the route positive and negative examples. Well, there have been plenty of negative examples. Plenty of negative examples. Negative examples such as the religious leaders, such as a rich man who leaves with his face downcast when he hears the call to follow Jesus, such as Peter who rebukes Jesus for Jesus saying he must die. Such as the disciples who are in constant arguing and they're seeking places of status and they're still not getting it. We've seen negative examples, and throughout we've seen positive examples. We've seen the faith of a woman who comes to Jesus even as Jesus is testing her. We've seen Peter in his confession. Yep, Peter and the disciples can be both on the negative and positive side of things. Mark's gospel. We've seen a child brought before them, and Jesus says, like this child. We've seen parents who are bringing their own children to Jesus for a blessing in faith. And what Mark does, we're sitting here going, man, what's next for us? What does discipleship look like? It can be a little bit confusing with all these positive and negative examples. Are the disciples good? Are they struggling? What about our own struggle? Mark ends with this story. He ends with this story. He ends with a positive example for us to emulate. The story of a blind man who is healed. And this positive example is meant to encourage our journey. It is meant to challenge us and to remind us that we should be encouraged in our own discipleship. Let's not end on the negative, Mark says, but hey, let's look at a positive example. And as you're thinking about following Jesus, should look something like this. Are you with me this morning? Amen. You made it. We're at the last of this series. Let's go to Mark chapter 10 and verse 46. It says, then they came to Jericho. And Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city. And a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus. He was sitting by the roadside begging. Bartimaeus is the only person to receive a healing in Mark's gospel that we know their name. He is the only person named by Mark who receives a healing. We know Jairus, but it's his daughter who is healed, and some others like that, their relationships. Peter's mother-in-law healed, but we don't know her name. We know Bartimaeus' name, and so that signals us to something. Mark is placing special emphasis on this story. Not only is there special emphasis on the story, Pastor, how do you know there's special emphasis just besides this name? Because it's the final story of this section, and because it's the final miracle in Mark's gospel. It's the last one he chooses to use. And knowing his name tells us that perhaps the Christian community knew this man personally, and we'll come back to that at the end today. This person, Bartimaeus, is being put forth as a positive example for all of us in discipleship for avoiding spiritual blindness and for following Jesus. How should we respond to Jesus this morning? Number one, we need to learn to seek his mercy all the more in our lives. We need to learn to seek his mercy all the more. Just to set the scene a little bit, Jericho is the last stop before Jerusalem. Jesus is not going to stop anywhere else. When you start chapter 11, he's coming into the city in the Palm Sunday setting. Jericho's the last stop. It was a beautiful city for the Middle East. It was called the City of Roses. It contained a huge winter palace for the Herods and their dynasty. A huge palace at the city's heart. And yet, even with this city's beauty, how many of you know there is an underbelly of sin and its consequences and its destruction that runs through even the most beautiful cities? It was the final stop for Jesus and his disciples before reaching Jerusalem. And Bartimaeus, his day, we need to begin to imagine the day of a blind man. And it would have begun like any other normal day. The days just running together. He would have awoken from his meager sleeping location, maybe on some hay somewhere in a stable. Maybe if he has just a little bit of shelter, he's got a mat he sleeps on. And he would have woke up that morning and began his day like every other day in his life. groping his way to the main roads to beg, or tapping if he used a stick to get around. He would have awoken when everybody else, the sun awakens their eyes. He would have been awoken by noise or movement or birds singing. And he would have remained in complete and utter darkness. He would have tapped his way to the main busy roads, his normal locations, routes he would use every single day by memory. He would have gone there in shabby, worn out, greasy, smelly clothes to beg for his day's food. Perhaps on the way to this location, he would luck out and already be given a morsel or two or a penny. And yet he would find his way to the main road. And it says as Jesus was leaving Jericho, and these main roads through the town often passed through city gates where the crowds and the important people would gather. And perhaps he's near a gate on this main road. He wants to give himself as much opportunity as possible to survive another day. The chill of the morning would still be on him, so the scriptures describe a cloak that he has, and he wraps that old greasy cloak around him, and he sits down in his normal spot. And so far, the smells and the sounds and the feel of the dust all seems normal to him. Until a moment when his ears perk up. He could hear a crowd coming down the road. He begins to wonder, is it the sound of Roman soldiers marching through Jericho? No, this crowd is more chaotic than that. And the movement of the feet doesn't sound in rhythm at all. He begins to wonder, is it the sound of priests and religious leaders? And he thinks, no, I don't hear prayers. I don't hear moving or song. I don't hear the sound. This is too big of a crowd. It's much more chaotic than that. Not knowing what's going on, he grabs sitting down, maybe an ankle or the clothes, or maybe he shouts up to somebody and he says, "Hey, what's happening?" There's commotion all around. Perhaps he hears shouts of Hosanna. Perhaps he hears shouts of discord or dissension or anger. Verse 47, when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Mark's storytelling is superb because it's brief. But in this brief moment, there is a picture of a man we are being called to consider as an example to us for discipleship, for effective discipleship. And there are several qualities that arise in this short story that if we're not breezing past on a speed reading mission, but if we're sitting in the passage and we're thinking, why does Mark end with Bartimaeus? What's the emphasis here? As we begin to meditate on it, we see Bartimaeus has some qualities that make for healthy discipleship. We see that Bartimaeus, first of all, is pitifully aware of his need. And if you're following in your notes, you've got your anchor points there on the back of your bulletin. Bartimaeus is pitifully aware of his need. This may seem obvious, but I think it bears stating again. Every day he lived in perpetual darkness, never perceiving the beauty of God's creation, never seeing or perceiving the loving expressions on the human face. And he moves through that world in a darkness, knowing he needs salvation, knowing he is pitifully aware that he needs the Lord. This awareness of need is a cornerstone. It is a cornerstone for the process of being a disciple, for the process of salvation in our lives. There's an old 60 Minutes interview from 1983. I tried to find footage of it. I could not. But it's pretty well documented. Because in the 60 Minutes interview of 1983, there's the famous interviewer Mike Wallace. Many of you will know that name. He sat down with a Holocaust survivor and an Auschwitz survivor named Yehiel Denur. Denur was the key witness in the 60s for what are known as the Nuremberg war crimes trials. So here you've got an interview from 1983 that's interviewing Denur about the trial of the 60s that goes all the way back to the war crimes of the Nazis. You see, Eichmann had escaped discovery. And for almost 20 years, he had hidden out in Argentina until the criminal investigators began to track these Nazis down one at a time. So it wasn't until the 60s that the trial went public. And for the first time in almost 2 decades, people were emotionally brought face to face with the greatest of atrocities in the history of the world. Eichmann was one of the leading organizers of the Holocaust, which accounted for up to 6 million Jews and undesirables in their death. There's a video clip, and Wallace in the interview plays this video clip for Denur to help Denur think about what he was feeling and thinking. And in the clip, you see him fighting back through, as he stares across at Eichmann, tears again and again and again and again, until at one point, just 30 minutes about into this interview, he utterly and completely faints. The horror and the stress of facing Eichmann across from the courtroom. Utterly faints. They literally take him out on a stretcher, out cold. You can still see footage of it on YouTube. Wallace asked Denur, what was going through your emotions? I want to know, what did it feel like to face this Nazi Eichmann? Was it fear? Denur shook him off. Was it hatred? Did you hate him? You were so overcome with hate and anger that you fainted. No, he said. Was it memories? Was it just the pure horrors? No, Denur answered. In the interview with Wallace, he explained it was the horror that Eichmann sat there in a room, seeing him as an ordinary man. Not in his uniform, not surrounded by soldiers, not with all of the wealth and the pomp of Nazi Germany. It was the horror of seeing him as an ordinary man and overcome by looking at this man who looked just like me, suit, glasses. He sat there as calmly as I did. Denur replied, I was afraid about myself. I saw that I am capable. I am like him. What a revelation. In the heat of that moment, the Nobel Prize-winning author, another one, would put it this way. There's a fine line separating good and evil, but the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not through classes of people, not between political parties either. The line between good and evil passes right through every human heart. Mark wants us to remember the darkness and the blindness of Bartimaeus, and our own spiritual darkness, and the groping and the begging our way through a dark world, aware of our own need. Now let's turn to some good qualities. Bartimaeus has a penetrating insight. Bartimaeus is pitifully aware of his need, but he also has a penetrating insight. Whatever he's heard when he grabs onto that ankle and says, hey, who's coming down the road? Notice carefully, they tell him, Jesus of Nazareth is coming. But what does he cry out? He doesn't cry out, Jesus of Nazareth, save me, have mercy on me. He changes the language. Something has happened in the rumors of the village and the town, and this blind man Bartimaeus has begun to put 2 and 2 together, and he cries out something very different. He cries out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. It's the only time Mark uses this phrase among a common person in the gospel. Later, Jesus will use the phrase about himself in his teachings of Jerusalem. Matthew's very fond of the phrase Son of David. He uses it a lot, but Mark has saved it for this special moment to signal us that Bartimaeus, with a small seed of faith, is somehow aware of the kingdom of Jesus. He's aware of his personhood. He's aware that this is the Messiah who has come to save Israel and to save the nations. And we can only imagine how small that seed might have been, but it burst out. And here's the point. Though he's physically blind, his spiritual eyes are opening up to the promised heir of the throne of David, to the one who is to come. And he serves as a model for each and every one of us, that though we may walk in darkness, if we're open-hearted to the truth about Christ, the light begins to shine. Bartimaeus had penetrating insight to something about this man. Finally, Bartimaeus had a passionate persistence for mercy. He cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And you love this scene. I love it too. They begin to rebuke him. "Be quiet. Hey, shh. There's a big crowd coming. Come on, you beggar. Get behind us." But what do the scriptures say? I love this line. He cried out all the more. It's like my hungry teenage boys who have eaten all they need on Thanksgiving weekend. Before I drive home, they've even been out to eat on Friday night, and yet we drive home, we walk into the kitchen, and the first thing they say is, "I'm hungry. What's for dinner? What's to eat?" And we look at them and say, "You've been eating all weekend. We've already had dinner tonight." But how many of you know once the hunger strikes a child, or especially a teenager, there's not going to be any satisfying it. Once they know they're hungry, so you better find a way to feed them, right? And I think spiritual hunger kind of works that way too. Yes, on the one hand, we're fully satisfied in the Lord. On the one hand, our thirst is quenched. We found our Savior. But each day we wake up hungry for our daily bread, that is Jesus. Hungry for the living waters, that is Jesus. And each day we wake up, and on the one hand we're being satisfied. On the other hand, Mark is saying, listen, disciples have this persistence in their pursuit of Jesus. And when they're going after Jesus, they say, "Jesus, Jesus." And when the voices in their head, or the world, or the circumstances of this life say, "Shh, it's not working. Shh, he doesn't hear you. Shh, you're behind the scene," they cry out, "All the more, all the more." I'm so grateful for our daily bread and living water. Number two, here's where the fingers really start to point to us in the preaching, and it's great news. Number two, take heart. He's calling you. How should we respond to Jesus? Mark's message would be to us this morning. Take heart. He's calling you too. Mark chapter 10 and verse 49. Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And so they called to the blind man. Jesus spoke to him. Take heart, or take courage, or be encouraged, or be cheered up, man. On your feet, they said. He's calling you. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped up to his feet and he came to Jesus. Here's the good news. Jesus does not overlook those who respond to who he is and seek his work in their lives. Jesus does not overlook the salvation of those who are responding to who he is and seek his work in their lives. And this is a message we need to hear again. Some of you need to hear this even right now. Take heart, be courageous, be encouraged, cheer up, don't waver, don't delay, don't fear. He's calling you. I'll never forget when Amber and I first started dating. We had spent the summer apart. We had visited each other just once, and I was very, very young. And I remember coming back to the college, and being young, I was a little bit nervous about this dating relationship on the college campus and how that was going to work and how that was going to look. And the first couple of days of this small Bible college, the cafeteria would be slammed with people, right? Everybody would be eating at the same time, on the same schedule. Classes hadn't started back yet. And everybody wanted to see old friends and new friends and who was coming in, the freshmen, etc. And so the cafeteria was slammed on that first day or two back. And I'll never forget getting my food. We had trays, and we would take the trays back and find a table, maybe with some buddies, and just kind of looking around to see if I could see Amber anywhere, and I really couldn't. Everything was so crowded, and so I thought, well, this table looks as good as any. I guess I'll see her when I see her today. And right when I put my tray down, I was still standing, and about 2 or 3 tables away, I saw Amber. There she was. And she was standing, putting her tray down at another table. And I'll never forget, I looked down, I thought, well, I'm here, she's over there, what do I do next, right? And I looked up the second time and I saw her waving. Come over here. There's a seat right here. Come this way. And I remember, it was such a shocking thing. I was like, I looked around. Who, me? Me? Like, I'm already the boyfriend, but I'm one, like, me? Like, is she waving at a friend? Right? And I hesitated. But how many of you know there's something greater at work in that romance than hesitation? It's the quickening of a heart. And when your heart quickens, you leave old tables behind for something new. The scriptures say that this man, Bartimaeus, he threw his cloak aside. Now, maybe we're not to make too much of this. But what you'll recognize if you've been studying with us is that this is a call narrative. We've seen a call narrative with these fishermen. When Jesus calls them, come and follow me, and the scriptures say they left their nets and immediately they began to follow Jesus. We've seen a call narrative with a man named Matthew who's in a tax collector's booth, and Jesus comes to him and says, follow me, and immediately what? He leaves the tax collector's booth and he begins to follow Jesus. We've seen a call narrative with the rich young man who approaches Jesus with a sincere heart, and Jesus says, leave your things and come and follow me, and yet he cannot. And he walks away downcast and in sorrow. And yet Mark leaves us with a positive example. Jesus, they say, call to him. And they say, come on, man, cheer up. He's calling you. Again, the focus on this call. And so Mark, in just great storytelling fashion, he says he leaves his clothes. He doesn't have much in this life. Old, greasy rags. But he leaves them behind all the same. And he begins to follow Jesus. There's something happens when the heart is quickened by our Savior, by our Lord. We discard the old for something greater. Number 3, what else does discipleship look like? How should we respond to Jesus when he's calling us? Number 3, receive your sight and follow him on the way. Verse 51. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked for him. And the blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Verse 52, it's so curious. Jesus says, go. He says, your faith has healed you. And immediately he received his sight. And how does Mark conclude this entire section? He followed Jesus on the way. He followed Jesus on the way. What a way to conclude. The man is healed. It is a positive physical example of the spiritual healing that takes place in every disciple when Jesus gives us our sight. It is a powerful picture. It is a living illustration of the process of discipleship in the life compressed into this man, Bartimaeus. And the results of discipleship are also there. The results of salvation are also there. What do these results look like? Discipleship looks like a blind men and women who have met Jesus, been healed, and go in faith. Where do they go, Pastor? Where do they go with this faith? They go after Jesus and they follow him on the way, on the journey to Jerusalem, on the journey to discipleship, on the journey of learning to pick up our cross and follow him, on the journey of learning to die to ourselves and to put old things behind us so that we might have life, on the journey of learning to serve and to humble ourselves, the lowest the lowest, to serve others. We follow him on the way. Now I want to return to how do we know his name? Bartimaeus. It's very likely that he becomes one of the committed followers of Jesus. You see, there were more than just the 12. The 12 had a special role and assignment as disciples. But we know there were women who followed and supported the ministry of Jesus. We know there were others. We know that at one time Jesus appeared to over 500 of his disciples after the resurrection. We know that when they go to the upper room, being obedient to Jesus, there was 120 there, committed followers of Jesus. And because we know the name of Bartimaeus, we can begin to imagine that he stayed true to his calling and to his discipleship. Because others began to know who he was. Maybe he was in that upper room. Maybe he was with those 500 who saw the risen Lord. But we know that this name began to spread, so much so that Mark, who becomes saved maybe a generation or a gap later, he knows Bartimaeus. People know Bartimaeus. What are you saying, Pastor Chad? Others in the early church who knew his name had firsthand testimony of the transformation of his life. And as you're following Jesus on the way, doesn't your testimony impact the world around you? Isn't it supposed to impact others who would say, you know what, I never met Jesus, but I met Bartimaeus, and I saw what Jesus did in his life. You know what, I never met Jesus yet, but I met my friend John who goes to Destination Church, or my friend Sue who goes to Destination Church. I met them, and they know Jesus, and they've described their transformation to me. What a picture of discipleship. Go! Your faith has healed you. Where do we go? We follow him on the way. I want you to stand with me, and we're going to close in a time of prayer and song today. As you're standing,
thank you for watching our video. If you liked it, share it with a friend and subscribe to our channel. We go live every Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can also support us by clicking the Give button. This allows us to continue to impact our community as well as help missions across the globe with the love of Jesus Christ. Thanks again for watching.